Hello, modern Europe, and welcome to the very last lecture podcast of the course. Today, we're going to be talking about the era of the Second World War. We're going to see how once again the world got dragged into a massive global conflict, one which would dwarf the destruction of the First World War. We'll cover some of the major turning points of the war, and we'll also talk about its darkest moment, the Holocaust. Finally, we will talk about the repercussions of the war, many of which we are still living with today. We'll talk about the beginnings of the Cold War, the era of superpowers, and the nuclear age. All of that in our last lecture podcast. The learning objectives for this unit are: Number 1, describe the policy of appeasement and understand how Hitler manipulated it to his advantage. Number 2, understand the basic narrative of World War II. Number 3, describe the Holocaust and its connection to the Second World War. And finally, assess the beginnings of the Cold War. Which brings us to World War II. The Second Global War lasted from 1939 to 1945, and it is by far the most destructive war in history. Even to this day, nothing has come close to it. Approximately 75 million people died. It was also the very first and only, knock on wood, war to use nuclear weapons. You see a picture there of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in Japan in 1945 when the Americans dropped a nuclear bomb on Japan, effectively ending World War II. To put it into perspective just how much more destructive World War II is, let's take a look at it in comparison to World War I. So in World War I, there were approximately 17 million deaths. In World War II, there were 75 million deaths. The difference is absolutely staggering. From World War II, we would actually also have color photography for the very first time. During the Second World War, women in many countries would actually serve in uniform for the first time. This is a rare color image of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS plotters at work at the Coastal Artillery Headquarters in Dover, England in December of 1942. Once again, Europe would be nearly destroyed by the fighting during World War II. But it wasn't just in Europe. The war would be fought all around the world once more. This would be a war where airplanes would play a greater role than ever before. Here you see an image of RAF fitters changing the engine of a Lockheed Hudson at Yundun in the Gambia in April of 1943. And here's an image of Lancaster bombers nearing completion in Avro's assembly plant at Woodford in Manchester in 1943. Tanks, which were only first invented in the First World War and played a really limited role in that war, would now be more important than ever before. Here's an image of a Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tank in action in August of 1944. World War II would be the ultimate clash of civilizations. On one side, the free democratic world rallied to stop Hitler, who wanted to institute his Third Reich, which was the official name that the Nazis gave to Germany under Hitler's leadership. The Third Reich, the idea being that the first empire was the Holy Roman Empire during the Middle Ages. The second empire was the empire instituted under Otto von Bismarck and the Kaiser with German unification, and now the Third Reich being under Hitler. The underside of the war would see untold human misery and cruelty and the murdering of over 6 million Jewish people by the Nazis and many others too. The principal consequences of World War II would be the end of European world dominance. Europe would be so devastated by the end of World War II that it would no longer be the principal controller of the world. And in fact, it would also lead to decolonization in much of the rest of the world, as Europeans find it impossible to keep up their former empires. In decolonization, we also see the spread of mass society to the rest of the world. And in the ashes of World War II, we see the redistribution of world power between two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, and the beginning of the Cold War. The overview of World War II pits similar countries against each other that were fighting in World War I. So on the Allied side, we have Britain, France, all the Commonwealth countries, which includes Canada. We also have China this time around, the USSR, at least after June of 1941, which is what Russia is now called, and the United States also after June 1941. The introduction of these two countries into the war would prove pivotal. On the other side, on what would be known as the Axis powers, we have Germany and Japan this time, also allied with Germany. Japan, of course, fought on the Allied side during World War I. Well, things have changed a lot since the First World War, and Japan now is a major power in its own right. Italy also changes sides. Italy will fight on German side as well, and Hungary. So one way to understand World War II is to think of it as two separate conflicts that end up joining together. So there was a conflict in Asia and a conflict in Europe. And these conflicts eventually get bigger and bigger, and eventually they join up together. And that's really what World War II is. So let's take a look at what was going on in Asia. So in Asia, the main destabilizing factor is the rise of Japan as an imperial power. So Japan, as I hinted at in the last podcast, was a bit different in its reaction to imperialism of Europeans. Japan, once it encountered the Europeans' power and understood industrialization, took it upon themselves to completely transform the country. This was a process known as the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration slowly saw Japan become an industrial power. In World War I, they fought in the war and contributed quite a bit. But by World War II, they were a major industrial power in their own right. Now, this is happening in the backdrop that a neighboring country, China, was doing the opposite. China was very slow to respond to industrialization, whereas Japan quickly industrialized. This imbalance of power left Japan the opportunity to start gaining more territory at China's expense. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and this essentially is the beginning of World War II. It's not the official beginning of World War II, but there will be nonstop war in this part of the world until 1945 when World War II finally comes to an end. So you could say that the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 is really what starts it. Japan invaded China in 1937, and at this point now we are truly into a full-blown war in Asia. Now, why is Japan doing this? Because Japan can. Japan is an ambitious country. It has its own imperialistic ambitions. So in many ways, it adopted all kinds of ideas from Europe, not just the industrial part, but also the imperial part as well, too. So as Asia falls into full-blown war, things are rocketing towards conflict in Europe as well. We see the rise of fascism in both Italy and Germany during the 1920s and 1930s. So Mussolini is dictator from 1925 onward, El Duce, and Hitler becomes dictator from 1933 onward, Der Führer. We also start to see, at least in Mussolini's instance, that we see some ambitions beyond their own countries. So Mussolini, for example, invades Ethiopia in 1935. Why? Because he could invade Ethiopia, and because he wanted to start to create an Italian empire of sorts as well, too. And in Germany, we start to see increasing anti-Semitism as Hitler begins to remodel the country. So Hitler also had his territorial ambitions too. Remember the concept of Lebensraum, which means living space. And Hitler certainly intended to increase German territory. Now, some of that territory he intended to regain what was lost during World War I and arguably was taken away from Germany unfairly. But he also had his eye on other parts of Europe which had never been part of Germany before. And the rest of Europe and the world, we have to understand that nobody wanted to have a war again. So there was a reluctance to confront Hitler in some of these ambitions because World War I had been so terrible. So many people had died. And also there was an understanding that, the Treaty of Versailles had been somewhat unfair to Germany, and so we should be flexible to some degree or another in order to prevent war and maintain world peace. this would bring about the idea of appeasement. So appeasement is most commonly associated with the man on the left, who was the British Prime Minister. His name was Neville Chamberlain. So Neville Chamberlain had many meetings with Adolf Hitler over the years in the lead up to World War II. And he tried to do everything he possibly could to avoid a war taking place. Appeasement essentially means that they kind of let Hitler get away with certain things with the understanding that Hitler wouldn't take it too far, and that if he did, then we would be back at war again. And nobody wanted that. So they were going to try everything they could to avoid getting us into a major conflict. But Hitler would certainly begin to push the boundaries. So one of the first ways that Germany began to increase its territory was with the Saar. So the Saar was a small territory that at the end of World War I had been separated from Germany. It's that little area in red. And France was given control of its Saar mines. In 1935, there was a referendum of whether Saar wanted to be rejoined with the German territory. The territorial status referendum took place on January 13, 1935, and over 90% of the Saar voters opted for reunification with Germany. And the rest of the world, when this happened, I mean, France was not pleased with it, but at the same time, they thought, well, you know, the Saar used to be part of Germany, and so we really should just let this take place, and so everyone just kind of let it happen. So this is the first territorial acquisition of Germany. It wouldn't be the last. So the next thing that Hitler did was he focused on rebuilding the German military. One area of Germany, the Rhineland, at the end of World War I, the Rhineland, it's this area in yellow here by the Rhine River, had come under the occupation of the Allied forces. In the Treaty of Versailles, German military presence was forbidden from all territory west of the Rhine and within 50 kilometers east of the Rhine. And this was later reaffirmed with the Locarno treaties of 1925, that this would be a permanently demilitarized zone. In 1929, however, Germany began to negotiate the withdrawal of Allied forces from the land, and the last Allied soldiers left the Rhineland in 1930. Following the Nazis coming to power in 1933, Germany began working towards rearmament and the militarization of the Rhineland. The reason why they wanted Germany not to have soldiers there is because it's right on the border of Belgium. This is where so much fighting had taken place during World War I. And then in 1936, Hitler finally broke all those treaties and ordered 3,000 German troops to move into the Rhineland. Now, this was celebrated in Germany because they just loved the idea that Hitler was standing up to the Allied powers. What did the Allied powers do? Well, kind of nothing. Nobody wanted war, and a lot of people argued, well, is it fair to say that Germany can't have military in its own land? Was that really fair? And so they didn't do anything. And here you see German troops marching into the Rhineland in 1936, and the people all happy and ecstatic. You see women giving the soldiers flowers. So from the German point of view, this was a celebrated moment, a moment where they were standing up to the Allied powers. They were getting back some of their dignity after World War I, and the rest of Europe kind of nervously sat on their hands and hoped against hope that this would be the end of Hitler's ambitions. Again, this is all about appeasement. At the time, they wanted to avoid war. However, Hitler's next move was much more provocative. In 1938, Hitler marched his troops south and annexed the country of Austria. The Austrian government fled, and this was a major provocation. Now, however, most of the people in Austria welcomed the Germans when they came. Hitler was a popular figure. He was seen to be someone who had turned the German economy around, and the Austrian government was not very popular at the time. And the rest of the world nervously watched as Hitler annexed this whole country. And what did they do? They didn't do anything because they thought, well, Austria is filled with German-speaking people, so yeah, maybe Germany and Austria being together, that's not such a big deal, I guess. Besides, we really don't want war. And here you see cheering crowds in Vienna, Austria, as the Germans come in and the Nazis take over. Again, generally speaking, in Austria, people liked it. Watch The Sound of Music for this period of history being depicted. So next, Hitler turned his attention to a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. So the Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia that was essentially filled with German people, German-speaking people, and people who were culturally German. The reason why it was part of Czechoslovakia was because of the reorganization after World War I. Originally, the Sudetenland had been part of the Austria-Hungary Empire, but after that disintegrated, it was given to the new country of Czechoslovakia. At this point when Hitler was making motions towards the Sudetenland, obviously the Czechoslovakians didn't like it, but we still had the same situation that the rest of Europe really didn't want war. And, certainly the argument would have been made, well, yes, it's not part of Germany, but it's part of Czechoslovakia, but it is filled with German-speaking people, so maybe we can all look away while he takes that, maybe. But things were getting serious. It was quite clear to everyone that Hitler was on, a shopping spree of territory around Germany, and this really had to come to an end. So our friend Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, met with Adolf Hitler another time in 1938. And his goal this time was try to get Hitler to agree to stop gobbling up more territories in Europe and hurtling the world towards war. No representatives from Czechoslovakia were brought in to have a say in what became known as the Munich Agreement of 1938. But in that agreement, and this is the pinnacle of appeasement, in that agreement, Hitler agreed that he would stop any more territorial acquisitions in return for the Sudetenland. He said, okay, look, I know that I annexed Austria. I know that, we got the Tsar in a referendum, and I know I started remilitarizing the Rhineland, but I promise, honest to goodness, that this is it, that the Sudetenland is the last thing I'm going to take. And Neville Chamberlain shook hands with him, and that was the agreement. And of course, we all know that this didn't end well. So despite the fact that Czechoslovakia really didn't like this idea, they didn't want to give up their territory willingly, the fact that the rest of the world did not want to go to bat for them meant that there was nothing they could do. They just had to accept the Munich Agreement, and Hitler was able to ride into the Sudetenland without even firing a shot. And like he had in other places, this was largely German-speaking peoples, and he was very popular amongst German-speaking peoples, and so he was meted by adoring crowds, like what you see here in September of 1938. So obviously, lots of things have happened over the past 5 years, and Europe has done everything they can to try to avoid war, led by Neville Chamberlain and this policy of appeasement, which is they've been trying to appease Hitler. So Neville Chamberlain announced the results of the agreement to the rest of the world, and hoping that this would be the end of German territorial expansion.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Of course, as we know, Hitler had no intention of stopping there. He had every intention of continuing on. So, in order to start to make real preparations for the inevitable war that was going to follow, Hitler made some alliances. So first, he made an alliance with his buddy Mussolini. And why not? Mussolini and Hitler were both fascists. They liked to talk about fascist things. And although in private, Hitler considered Mussolini a bit of an idiot and didn't really respect him that much, in May 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel, uniting them in an alliance. The final chess piece that Hitler needed to put into place before he began his next move was to make a secret agreement with the Soviet Union, with Joseph Stalin. This was achieved with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act in 1939. This pact essentially would divide up the country of Poland between the two countries, because that was going to be Hitler's next move. He was planning on invading Poland. So here you see Poland is right between the Soviet Union and Germany. So clearly, had Germany just invaded Poland without the Soviet Union's agreement, that would have almost certainly provoked war between the two countries, which Hitler wasn't quite ready to have happen. Now, I think Hitler realized that going into Poland was probably a bridge too far. After all of those other arguments were based on the idea that, there were German people there and it made sense for Germany to absorb German-speaking people. But in Poland, there are Polish-speaking people, and it really, there's no excuse other than pure territorial ambition, which would cause Germany to want to invade Poland. And indeed, this was all about Lebensraum. That means, more living space for German people. And Germany, against the agreement that he had made with the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, invaded Poland in September of 1939. And this was it. This was the final straw. The rest of the world finally got off their hands and decided they had to do something about Hitler. So here you see German troops parading through Warsaw after the invasion of Poland. This time, no cheering crowds. Things are starting to get nasty.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland. But Hitler would not have it. He had evidently made up his mind to attack Poland whatever happened. And although he now says he put forward reasonable proposals which were rejected by the Poles, that is not a true statement. The proposals were never shown to the Poles, nor to us. And though they were announced in the German broadcast on Thursday night, Hitler did not wait to hear comments on them, but ordered his troops to cross the Polish frontier the next morning. his action shows convincingly that there is no chance of expecting that this man will ever give up his practice of using force to gain his will. He can only be stopped by force. And we and France are today, in fulfillment of our obligations, going to the aid of Poland, who is so bravely resisting this wicked and unprovoked attack upon her people. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace. But a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted, and no people or country could feel itself safe, had become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage.
So after that very sad speech where Neville Chamberlain admitted that his whole policy of appeasement had not worked, Britain was at war with Germany, and lots of the rest of the world followed suit. Certainly all of the Commonwealth countries. So Canada declared war with the Nazis very shortly thereafter, and other countries followed suit. Notably not the United States, though. Just like the First World War, they will stay out of this war for the first bit. So the early part of the war did not go well at all for the Allied forces. Germany had an initial wave of success, and part of this was because of the strategy that Hitler and the Nazis adopted at the beginning, which was something they called the Blitzkrieg strategy. The Blitzkrieg strategy was using a huge army of basically all tanks, which could move incredibly quickly across the countryside, and then coupled that with air support. This allowed the Germans to, within 6 weeks, defeat France in 1940. So here you see Hitler walking through occupied Paris with the Eiffel Tower in the background. So it just was not going very well at all. At the same time, Germany began a campaign of bombing British cities. The Blitz would actually turn London into rubble, and people would be forced to spend their nights in the subway system, the underground, in order to survive. And Germany also sent out submarines and destroyed Allied shipping lines. They pretty much controlled the Atlantic in the beginning of the war. So things were not going very well at all. So this map, I think, is really a great way of just presenting how bad the war was going for the Allies in the beginning. So this is a map of Europe in 1941, and everywhere you see that is gray or black is under the control of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. But as I had said before, Mussolini was really the junior partner in this relationship. So let's just state the obvious. It's all under the control of Nazis and Hitler. And you can imagine that if you're in the United Kingdom right now, that lone country on the edge of Europe that's not been taken over by the Nazis, you are genuinely terrified at this point. Things are not going well. So this is where the two wars that I've described, the war in Asia and the war in Europe, are going to join up together, and it's going to turn into a world war. And it happens because Japan and Germany form an alliance. So why would they do this? Well, it's because they both see a common enemy. Although Germany had formed that secret agreement with the Soviet Union, Hitler knew that sooner or later he was going to have to deal with Stalin. That Stalin was not just going to sit idly by as Germany solidified its position across all of Western Europe, because that would be a long-term threat to Joseph Stalin. And so he knew that eventually the Soviet Union was going to turn on him. So he took preparations to make sure that he was going to make it as difficult as possible for them. And so one way to do that would be to form an alliance with Japan, because Japan is on the other side of the Soviet Union. Likewise, Japan also sees the Soviet Union as a threat, because as Japan is building up its empire in Asia, it knows that eventually the Soviet Union is going to not like that either, because it would be a threat to them. So both the two countries see the Soviet Union as a threat, and so they make an alliance in 1940. So while Hitler was engaged in his war with the rest of Europe, he continued his internal war against Jewish people. In any of the areas that he occupied, the Jewish people living there faced increasing restrictions in Nazi-occupied Europe. They created ghettos in cities beginning in 1940. So they forced Jewish people from their homes and forced them to congregate and live in these very, very, very small, dense packed urban areas where people were living practically on top of one another and where disease could run rampant. The conditions in the ghettos were terrible. There often was not enough food. And that was only the beginning of what was going to happen. In the beginning, the Nazis conducted a policy where they wanted to encourage emigration. They wanted to encourage Jewish people to leave Nazi-occupied area. However, from 1940 onward, this changed from a policy of emigration to extermination. And essentially, the doors were shut from that point onward, and the Nazis focused just on killing Jewish people. From 1941 onward, the Nazis utilized death squads and pogroms. Pogroms are basically where they would give carte blanche to private citizens to essentially create lynching gangs, which could go around and kill Jewish people without any fear of censure. So in the late 1930s, Jewish people were desperately trying to get out of Europe before those doors shut. One horribly shameful example in Canadian history is when the German transatlantic liner St. Louis arrived in Canada in 1939. On board the St. Louis were 900 Jewish refugees who were seeking sanctuary from Nazi Germany. Canada, under the direction of the Prime Minister Mackenzie King, turned them away. They were also refused entry into the United States. The ship was forced to return to occupied Europe. Nearly half of the people on that ship would ultimately die in the Holocaust, which is just an incredibly sad and shameful part of our country's history, that we turned them away in that time of need. You know, generally speaking, quite a bit of the anti-Semitism and the laws against Jewish people were widely supported by German people. There were, movements to boycott Jewish stores. So here's a picture of a sign used during an anti-Jewish boycott, and it says, "Help Germany from Jewish capital. Don't buy in Jewish stores." And this is from 1933, in the lead up to the war. Obviously, things would get a lot worse for Jewish people over time. In the beginning, it started just as a widespread state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and eventually Jewish people are forced to identify themselves using Stars of David and are forced to move into ghettos. So the deportation of Jews to extermination camps began about a month after the introduction of the Star badges, the Star of David badges, which Jews were required to wear in occupied Europe. The death camps and the concentration camps would take the Holocaust to a whole new level. So what the Nazis called the final solution began in earnest in 1942. No longer were Jews allowed to leave occupied Europe. From now on, the Nazis would concentrate on murdering them. The emergence of death camps were essentially factories of death. They were designed to kill massive amounts of people in the most efficient way possible. One of those death camps was the Auschwitz concentration camp, and you see Jewish people in this picture arriving at the camp in May of 1944. Most people would be dead within hours after arriving on trains in the camp. The only people who would be spared even for a short period of time would be young, healthy men, and only because they needed the labor to dispose of bodies. Women and children and old people were killed within just a few hours of arriving at the camp. They used gas chambers in order to efficiently murder as many people as possible. They had crematoria set up to burn the bodies. All of this was designed to depersonalize killing on a mass scale. This was the bureaucratized and government-sanctioned murder of over 6 million Jewish people. So eventually things turn around 1941 is the year that it happens, the turning point in the war. And there's two major events which turn the tide against the Axis powers, against Germany, Italy, and Japan. The first major event is a complete strategic misstep by Hitler. He decides to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Now, if you recall from this course, we've talked about this already. Generally speaking, in history, it is a very, very bad idea to invade Russia, as Napoleon found out a century earlier. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they faced incredibly fierce resistance. Soviet Union is a very large place. They also had to transverse this huge country. The Russians followed the same strategy they always had, which is to withdraw, let the troops come in, and then attack fiercely once winter comes, and Germany was not well equipped for winter. So you might wonder, why on earth did Hitler make this mistake? Partially it was because he felt that war with the Soviet Union was inevitable, that sooner or later Stalin was going to attack him because he had so much success in Western Europe that this just proved to be too much of a threat for Stalin, and that war was going to come one way or another, and Hitler would prefer to choose it on his own terms. The other is a little bit of hubris, no doubt. Hitler had great success that far in the war, and he really thought that his success would continue. It didn't. The invasion of the Soviet Union turned out to be a disaster. The German army was essentially stuck at Stalingrad, where there was fierce fighting for over a year. There you see a Russian soldier, waving the red banner over the central plaza of Stalingrad in 1943. So the Soviet invasion not going very well at all. A similar strategic misstep was made by the Japanese, and we'll see that next. So just a few months after Germany invades Russia, Japan decides to attack the United States, bringing the United States into the war. Now, why did Japan do this? So as Japan, like Germany, had lots of success and was expanding in Asia and into the Pacific, they felt that sooner or later America was going to go to war against them, that America would not let them continue to gobble up all of these territories in the Pacific because it was going to butt up against American interests. And perhaps they were right, but the truth is that at that point in time there was little appetite for war within the United States. Like the First World War, there was generally an isolationist vibe in the air, so to speak. However, Japan completely misjudged what the reaction would be to the bombing of the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Japan believed that if it could strike a decisive blow against the Americans by bombing their main naval base, that it would so demoralize the Americans that they would sue for peace immediately, and they would, with their tail between their legs, back off and allow Japan to keep all of their possessions in the Pacific. Well, that is obviously not what happened at all. All at once, he unified the country, and America was able to turn its industrial might. And I say industrial might because at this point in time, America really had already begun its path to becoming a superpower. And when America turns all of its factories onto the war effort, and remember, it had also sat out the war up until this point, so its soldiers were fresh, it was a major turning point in the war. So for Germany, Japan, and Italy, things were now going to take a turn for the worse. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was, in retrospect, a complete strategic blunder on the part of the Japanese. So all at once now, there was the Soviet Union on one side of Japan. On the other side, they had the United States of America. And in Europe, now Germany had to contend with a war on two fronts. They had the Soviet Union on one side, and then they had the looming likely reinvasion of Europe that was almost certainly going to come on the coast somewhere of France. Where? Nobody knew, but it was going to come. So after 1943, we are entering into the final stages of the war. On June 6, 1944, the long-awaited and anticipated Allied D-Day invasion of Normandy began. D-Day was the largest seaborne invasion in history. The operation began the liberation of German-occupied France and later Western Europe, and it laid the foundations for the Allied victory on the Western Front. Between 1944 and 1945, Germany found itself slowly surrounded. On one side, it had Britain and Canada and other Commonwealth countries, the United States invading, and on the other side, it had the Soviet Union. In April of 1945, with Soviet troops at the doorstep of his bunker in Berlin, Hitler committed suicide along with his mistress Eva Braun. A month later, Germany surrendered in May of 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. However, the war in the Pacific continued on for some time. So, throughout the latter stages of the war, the United States had been secretly working on a project that was dubbed the Manhattan Project, and it was a collective effort of many different scientists to develop the very first nuclear weapon. The Pacific War was not going very well. Although the United States was slowly pushing the Japanese back, going island to island, the Japanese were not likely going to surrender. A decision was made by the President of the United States, which remains controversial to this day, to use the very first nuclear weapons in warfare, and in fact the only times that nuclear weapons have ever been used in warfare. An atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and this finally resulted in the Japanese surrendering. World War II was finally over. So in 1945, the deadliest conflict in the history of the human race had finally come to a conclusion. And yet, just as it was ending, a new conflict was beginning, and this would be a very different one. The so-called Cold War would see the world divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, towards the end of the war, most people knew that this conflict was likely coming. Although the Soviet Union and the United States were on the same side, both saw that the destruction of Germany and Japan was inevitable. What came next was what was on everyone's mind. Although the United States was the first country to develop nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union was not far behind them, and within a couple of years after the end of World War II, they tested their own nuclear weapons. And this would begin a nuclear arms race between the two countries. Really, what we see is competing world ideologies, a form of communism versus capitalism. The entire world was essentially divided between their two spheres of influence. On one side, we had the liberal democracies led by the United States. On the other side, we saw Soviet communism. A so-called Iron Curtain descended across Europe. That's what Winston Churchill called it. And on one side of the Iron Curtain were all of the Soviet countries that had been gobbled up during World War II as the Soviet Union had pushed Germany back. The dividing line really fell within Germany itself. Germany was divided up between the two victoring powers. And so on one side we had West Germany, which would be under the control of the Western powers. And Western Germany would join that alliance of Western powers and join NATO, which would be the alliance between them. On the other side would be the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, all of the Soviet countries. Now, because the two powers couldn't directly fight one another, and the obvious reason why they couldn't fight one another is because to do so would end the world as we know it. It would be a nuclear war, and a nuclear war would destroy the entire planet. And so the war never could get hot, which is why they called it a Cold War. Instead, the Cold War was fought through proxies and satellite or friendly states. That means that since the Soviet Union and the United States couldn't fight directly, they fought through others. So one example of where the Cold War becomes hot is in the Korean War. So in the 1950s, there was a civil war in Korea. On one side of the conflict was a communist north, which was supported by the Soviet Union, and the southern part of Korea was supported by the United States. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate, and in fact, that division is still there today between North and South Korea. A similar conflict is the Vietnam War, in which, again, a civil war broke out in the country of Vietnam. One side was communist, the other side was capitalist. The Americans fought on the capitalist side. Now, as a rule, whenever one of the two superpowers directly gets involved in a conflict, which the Americans did in Vietnam, the other side can't get involved. So just as in Korea and in Vietnam, the Americans actually fought, the Soviet Union stayed out. And instead, what the Soviet Union did is they supplied and supported the other side. However, the Soviet Union occasionally got directly involved too, and America stayed out. So the war in Afghanistan would see another civil conflict, and in this case, Soviet troops directly got involved in that conflict, and instead, America and NATO stayed out, but they supported the capitalist side in that conflict with money and resources. So the Cold War would last all the way up until the end of the 1980s, when finally the Soviet Union would collapse for a variety of reasons, and the Berlin Wall, which separated East Berlin from West Berlin, which you see in the picture here, would eventually come down, Germany be reunited, and the Cold War would end. And this brings us to the end of the course. Well, everyone, I hope you have enjoyed this raucous route through history from the French Revolution to World War II and the Cold War. It's been my privilege to have been your professor this term. I hope you'll go on to take more history courses, or at least you will do better in Jeopardy as a result of this course. That is my great hope. In any respect, I hope you all have a wonderful break, and thanks again for coming through history with me.